Should be preparing. Okay, there we go. We are now officially going live. I'll wait another minute or two before I do my intro, just in case we have any other people joining us.
Just curious, where's it live streaming?
It is live streaming on our Facebook uh, page and also on our YouTube channel.
Hello, Facebook and YouTube.
I'm going to double check and make sure they're actually showing up there right now. Yep. Yep. I just realized my cat is in here with me, so I apologize if the cat gets noisy.
No worries.
Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, everyone who is joining us. My name is Kara Kreckler, and I am UCPL's Head of Adult Services. I'd like to welcome everyone to our keynote kickoff for our 2022 Adult Summer Reading Program, Secrets of the Deep. As you're probably aware, we usually do a deep dive into a big book or a pair of books over the summer, but this year we decided to shake things up a little bit and tie together our 3 monthly book groups, focusing on the dual themes of oceans and secrecy.
Mm.
Um, our first book discussion will take place next Monday at 7 p.m. via Zoom, and that will be our Orcs and Aliens science fiction book group. And we are talking about the near future science fiction title, We Are Satellites by Sarah Pinsker. Before I hand over the reins to Melody Jew, our guest speaker, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. Please try to keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, just for the cats and dogs and kids that show up. And if you have any questions or need technical assistance, please use the chat feature. I will be monitoring that, so I'll try and help you out if you have any questions. Um, after the after the presentation, there will be plenty of time for questions, and at that point, we'll try to use the hand raising feature of Zoom in an attempt to keep things manageable. One final note, in the interest of transparency and privacy, this is being live streamed to our Facebook and YouTube channels, so feel free to keep your video off if you'd like, and just know that what you say could be um, seen on YouTube. Um, so with that out of the way, I am thrilled to welcome our speaker, Melody Jew. Professor Jew is an associate professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, working across the fields of ocean humanities, science fiction, science studies, and media theory. She is the author of Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater, which won the 2020 Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science Book Award, and co-editor with Rafico Ruiz of Saturation and Elemental Politics. Professor Jew has published articles in journals including Grey Room, Configurations, Women's Studies Quarterly, Resilience, and Media plus Environment. Her new work explores the mediations of seaweeds in trans-Pacific contexts. Her presentation tonight, Diving into Fiction, explores the commonality between diving, bookshelves, and fiction. So welcome, Professor Jew.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so happy to be virtually in conversation with all of you, talking about oceans and science fiction, especially at a library that's a little bit distant from the ocean itself. I think the ocean's important for everyone, for so many reasons. When I look at the ocean, I think interconnection. I think of the way it connects so many pathways around the world, and also has so many interesting life forms that are also incredibly important for the health and well-being of the planet, including acting like trees. The ocean makes a lot of our oxygen. So thank the ocean, for all these wonderful inhalations. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Ooh, are we going? There we go. All right, so my presentation is called Diving into Fiction, and I thought I would sort of structure this talk in a conversational way. So I'll be drawing on some material that's from my book, Wild Blue Media, but also some examples of contemporary ocean science fiction. And I wanted to start by telling you how I got into this in the first place. So a long time ago, when I was a graduate student, I had come to grad school with the intention to study science fiction, and I had a sort of abstract topic that I quickly became disenchanted with, and I wondered, what am I doing? What do I really want to write about? So I entered this period of a lot of sort of self soul searching, and I had grown up in San Diego for some of my early years, and had always loved the ocean. Like, turn on a nature documentary on PBS. If it has the ocean, I would be there and completely tuned in, not falling asleep. And it just so happened that my first year of grad school, I was watching the documentary from the BBC, Blue Planet, and Blue Planet 2 now is out. So it's been that long, but many of you have probably seen this, and it's wonderfully narrated by David Attenborough with his sort of storytelling, grandfatherly British accent. And at one moment in the episode on the deep sea, David Attenborough cites a very compelling statistic and says that there have been more people in outer space than to the very deepest part of the ocean. And then he proceeded to describe how the ocean is full of strange and alien creatures that experience conditions so different from life on the terrestrial surface. And so I was listening to this as a science fiction scholar, going, huh. So, here's an example of a science fictional description that's taking place in a nature documentary. It's not taking place in a bound book. So then I started to explore a little further, and I was really influenced by a book called Alien Ocean: Anthropological Voyages in Microbial Seas. And this was written by Stefan Helmrich, who's an anthropologist at MIT. And this is an amazing book. I thought of it as so clearly written. It was like a bedtime story for academics. So it had just the right kind of proportion of interesting theoretical references to other works, but it also really, it did something interesting, which was look at the stories and analyze the stories that scientists were telling about life in the ocean. And in microbiology in particular, Helmrich looked at how microbes were being described, sometimes also as aliens. And he, in this book, helped me become aware how even aquariums, when you go to see aquariums, there's such a kind of convergence between the outer space and ocean. So the way that aquariums are lit to be very dark, and then they kind of have this big cinematic, opening to a well-lit and often large aquarium space, and are also sometimes in the staging, use science fictional techniques to kind of portray these strange and fantastical creatures that you might encounter. So both of these were really influential to me as I was first getting started. So I started to read more widely and ask, well, who else has written about the ocean? And I discovered that ocean humanities was beginning to be a description for the kind of interdisciplinary humanities work for all these people from different fields who were curious about the ocean. And I also came across Rachel Carson's well-loved text, The Sea Around Us. Rachel Carson may be familiar to you as the activist who wrote Silent Spring, which was a very important text in environmental justice that analyzed the impact of DDT as a pesticide on crops. But before she wrote that book, she actually wrote 3 ocean books. And in this text, Carson herself, she never learned how to scuba dive. So she had to use her imagination to synthesize what she was reading and then tell a story to the public about the history of the oceans and what it would be like to observe the very deepest conditions of the ocean. So in one passage, she writes that man might be able to, even if they can't physically go in the ocean, re-enter it mentally and imaginatively, inventing mechanical eyes and ears that can recreate for his senses this world long lost, but a world that in the deepest part of his subconscious mind, he'd never wholly forgotten. And Rachel Carson herself spent a lot of time, oops, sorry, went too fast, spent a lot of time around coastal North Carolina. And this is actually close to where I was living while I was doing my PhD. So the island in the center here, this is the Duke University Marine Laboratory, and I got to teach summer school here a few times, this class called Literature, Science, and the Sea. And this is, it was a really wonderful place to be, to hang out and have lunch with scientists at picnic tables while also teaching a literature class. And it was in this small town that I decided to get scuba certified. So I thought, I'm reading about the ocean and all of its strange and wonderful creatures. How can I'm relying on secondhand accounts here. I should get in the ocean myself. And so this became a really important part of my training, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So fast forward a number of years, I completed a dissertation and got a job here at UC Santa Barbara. And I wrote a book called Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater. And I start this book out by saying, when I went to get scuba diving certified, I would be floating in the water, and every time I felt out of control, I would shift from the horizontal position like a swimmer. I would try to stand up, and this kept happening until I got a kind of a better handle on my buoyancy. And this got me thinking, I wonder how often my terrestrial habits come out in other circumstances. Do these matter in language and the way people tell stories as well? It's certainly true of mapping practices, and this fun map here, which was created by the artist Santa Dalloway, does a fun inversion, and I think it really nicely draws attention to the way that in conventional mapping, we blanket the ocean as a uniform blue and treat it as a homogeneous space. And by inverting the kind of elevation colorings that are usually used in mapping, she's pointing out, like, look at the depth in the trenches that would be significant to, like, maybe whales or other creatures living and traversing the deep periodically. How about we shift our perspective and think about this? Or I also talk about the example of Google Ocean Street View. So if any of you have played around with Google Ocean, they have, Google Earth, there's a couple ocean sites. And so you can take the street view, but it's underwater. And I thought about this and played around. It's like, street view is kind of an illusion. You can look around, but really what it's doing is importing a terrestrial sort of based technology like the street, and it's plunking it underwater. And so I was wondering, like, well, how often do we see this? How often do we see the terrestrial appearing in the oceanic? Is there a terrestrial bias to the way that we represent the ocean? at like a few salient features at a time, or the way that we describe or portray the ocean? Are these also other questions? Um, but I also wanted to think about what are the conditions of observation underwater. So in part of my field work, I went to observe these underwater sculptures that are near Cancun in Mexico, off a small island. And these were created by Jason DeCaires Taylor, if he's familiar. And he creates these sculptures often to draw attention to issues of climate change and ecological sensitivity. And I noticed that the way he was representing his sculptures was always like a portrait. But when I tried to visit these in person, there was a strong current and the water was a little opaque. And this was the best I could do. So this was my photograph. Hovering over them, or sometimes like swimming to the side to try to stay in place as I was observing the sculptures. And so I began to think, wow, the museum underwater is very, very different than any terrestrial museum. Because in the terrestrial museum, there's sort of a don't touch policy, and you walk, or if you're in a wheelchair, sort of glide around where the sculptures are. But here, the conditions of current and the clarity of the water would change on a daily basis depending on, weather conditions. These were all highly variable factors. And the sculptures themselves, how could you talk about preservation when in fact living things were designed to, or were intended to grow on these, maybe becoming co-artists to make them. So I was thinking about all these, I think I'll stay here for one more moment. So I was thinking about all these questions, and I began to ask in my book, like, okay, so is the ocean a science fictional space? Not just because it has strange creatures, but because it makes us conscious of our terrestrial habits. And it maybe estranges us from the way that we're used to understanding something familiarly, or talking about it, or narrating it in different ways. So I'm going to talk about now two different approaches to oceans in science fiction. The first one is just science fictions that talk about the ocean. And then the second one, I'll come back to my book and talk about what I mean in a little more depth about the ocean as a science fictional space. Okay, so ocean is a topic for science fiction. I'm just going to go through some greatest hits here and point out a few themes in each of the next couple slides with lots of colorful book covers. Okay, so I know your reading group is going to be reading Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is such a classic book, and really interesting to reapproach from different kinds of historical context. One thing I found really interesting is that Verne wrote this right after the first laying of the transatlantic cable across the Atlantic, so that for the first time people could send telegrams or from Europe to the United States. So there was a real kind of surge of interest in the seafloor because of this. Other classics in ocean science fiction, Solaris might be familiar to some. This book by a Polish author, Stanislaw Lem, sort of famously imagines a whole planet that's a sentient ocean. This was later adapted into a George Clooney film, as well as a experimental kind of film by the Russian director Tarkovsky. But anyway, it imagines a sentient ocean as the protagonist. And even though the scientists are trying as hard as they can to understand the ocean, it keeps kind of thwarting their attempts. So it's kind of a classic model of the more you try to understand what's completely radically alien from your own point of view, sort of the more futile this gets. And there's some really interesting kind of psychological elements to this too. Another one I'll highlight is Michael Crichton's Sphere. I actually don't like this one very much. I was really upset at the end of the book because the one female character and the one black character both die off because they're not rational enough to handle whatever's going on underwater. And the main character, Norm, is the one that like succeeds. And I was like, oh no, I can't do this. But it's one in a long sort of tradition of science fictions that imagine and some kind of stranger alien presence located on the seafloor. And of course, the seafloor also figuratively is like the unconscious, or that which hasn't risen to the surface of awareness yet. Um, Other science fiction books that are really amazing don't have oceanic elements, even though you wouldn't maybe guess so from the title or the cover. And one author that I think really channels some interesting oceanic elements is Ted Chiang. So his short story, Story of Your Life, was recently made into the film Arrival, if anyone's seen this. The main character is a linguistics professor, and she gets tapped to translate this alien language upon arrival of these strange beings on Earth. And I have a screenshot of this to the right, and you can see that the inspiration for the aliens starts to look a little bit maybe octopus-like. Although a couple of my students have pointed out they look like hands with almost digits as they ambulate around. And even their language is a little bit inky, like squid or octopus ink. And they've just made a character there in the center of the circle. And so that I think was a really interesting sort of channeling of the oceanic into science fiction. And another story in his book Exhalation, called Exhalation, features these mechanical beings who have they're all the energy that they use is from a pressure differential. So they have lungs that they are these like almost like scuba tanks, and then they change these out periodically. And the places they change them out at are like cafes where they socialize and trade gossip. And I thought it was just really incredible as a scuba inspired science fiction. There's also been a really, I think, strong engagement with oceans and science fiction in African American science fiction or Afrofuturism, or as Nnedi Okorafor prefers, African futurism, which centers the African continent rather than the African diaspora. These are some really fabulous stories as well. So Lagoon imagines that aliens have landed off the coast of Lagos, Nigeria, and they come to benevolently to sort of grant wishes and remediate the environment. And it ends up being a really interesting story that imagines sort of fantastically how Nigeria could transition off a dependency on oil and petroleum, and instead work with the aliens to kind of have this other or new energy source. And a lot of sea life is transformed in the process, and so there's kind of an interesting oscillation between land and sea here. Octavia Butler, who's very beloved in the science fiction community, has pretty oceanic themes in Dawn, where the aliens in this is the first novel in the trilogy. The aliens have oceanic origins, and they still have sort of tentacles as a vestige from that earlier evolution. Samuel Delany, his short story Driftglass, has almost a kind of mermaid-like theme and concerns working class people in cables. And then more recently, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who's been writing about marine themes for a little while, has a new collection of poems out in a book called Undrowned, where she was sort of reading these whale field guides and then writing with, but also against these in a kind of speculative way to think about connections between Black feminism and the sort of what's happened to the sort of overhunting of whales. So it's a really, really interesting and provocative read. Now, another register for African American science fiction or Afrofuturism has actually been not just through literature, but through sound. So when I was in graduate school, a number of my colleagues, including Jonathan Howard, who's now at Yale, were interested in the mythology of Drexia. So this was a musical group started in Detroit, that's sort of in the techno scene, and they didn't write it, but they produced all this imaginative music, asking the question, what if the unborn children from mothers who were cast overboard during the transatlantic slave trade, what if those children somehow survived and were able to transition from the womb to the salt water of the ocean and somehow create these underwater communities that thrived? And it's really quite a provocative fiction. And again, was sort of communicated in sound, but that mythology has since been taken up by authors like Rivers Solomon in her recent book, The Deep. There's a new graphic novel out called The Book of Drexia. And then I think Clipping also had a song on NPR recently, also called The Deep, that was kind of an homage to Drexia. There have also been another trend, and this is the last, I think, sort of overview one I'll share briefly here, which is that one other topic for ocean science fiction has been, well, what if people sought refuge underwater from harmful UV rays, ultraviolet rays? So that's a theme that comes up in Kobo Abe's Inter Ice Age 4, and then also this recent English translation of The Membranes by Chiu-Ta-Wei, a Taiwanese author. And I couldn't help but think of this in relation to coral reefs, because corals, when they fluoresce from stress due to too warm of water, the fluorescence is also a form of protection against ultraviolet rays. So I was thinking about the similarities we find with coral in real life and with people fleeing underwater in these kind of climate fictions. So there are a lot of competing definitions for science fiction, and I won't get into this too much, but one thing I've noticed is that usually people create a definition of science fiction based on the kind of fiction they like or that they like to read. So this can be highly variable, and there's lots of fun author debates between like Margaret Atwood and Ursula Le Guin, where they've been really at odds. But if I had to create one personally, I'd say that for me, at its best, one thing science fiction offers are strange perspectives, or new conceptual breakthroughs that encourage the reader to look at their normal world really differently. And so it kind of leaves you wondering, like, instead of maybe defining science fiction just by something like presence of aliens or presence of time travel. So I think this estrangement factor is really key. So this leads me back to the ocean. Does the ocean also offer strange new perspectives on language? Is the ocean a science fictional environment? Okay, so talking about diving again, this was I think I mentioned my story about trying to stand up when I was diving earlier, but I've tried to do as much diving field work as I can, and I still feel pretty new at this. I have about 80 dives under my belt, which is still considered pretty new. The real hardcore folks say that you have to have like at least 200 before you're finally like kind of real, considered experienced. So like I'm getting there, but it's going to take me like maybe, I don't know, 10 more years at this rate. But this is a selfie I took in off the coast of Santa Cruz Island, which is one of the Channel Islands near Santa Barbara. So in these conditions, it's really cold. It's not like the East Coast. So I had a very thick wetsuit, a hood and gloves, and I'm like really thermally insulated and ready to go. And so I've tried to compare these two things, real life diving with figurative diving or imaginative diving, like diving into fiction or diving into the life world of an alien, of kind of a sea creature. And in my book, one really strange text I talk about is Brazilian author Willem Flusser's fictional science text called Vampiroteuthis infernalis, or the vampire squid. And one of the sort of things he sets up in the beginning is that, well, maybe we can't observe the seafloor directly or physically in the ocean, but maybe we can do it by imagining what the life world of the vampire squid is like. So he actually ends up with this pretty fascinating tale of like, well, wondering questions about like, well, so the vampire squid, which in real life is not vampiric, it's actually really cute. It just eats like mucus and stuff out of the water. And you can find these off the coast of Monterey as one example. The vampire squid, has a really different body plan than humans. So it has, tentacles, it has radial symmetry, and it has the head kind of up there. That's very different than humans, who are bilaterally symmetrical, and we're kind of like a coat hanger, we stand upright. So he wondered, well, how might that other physiology offer different points of view, for that creature on its world? And I began to think about how this has connections to metaphor and how we use metaphors to express emotions. And often these are coded based on our own terrestrial habitation. So in one famous study from 1980, Metaphors We Live By, the authors write that the word up is not understood purely in its own terms, but actually emerges from all the motor functions that we have, kind of in our normal lives, that have to do with our position relative to gravity, right? Like, where we stand up in it. And so they write, imagine a spherical being living outside any gravitational field with no knowledge of anything else. What could up mean to such a being? What could up mean to the vampire squid floating in the deep sea? Could it say things like, I'm up for going to dinner today, or like, like my spirit sank. These ways of speaking don't seem like they would quite translate to a creature that's living in the ocean. So I began to think, prepositions and the way we use these, talking about directions, talking about orientations. These are all things that, at least in English, really reflect the way that we're so used to these conditions of gravity, not just floating. So if you were to really imagine the speculative fiction or science fiction tale, like what's life like from the point of view of a vampire squid or other sea creature, you really have to take into consideration gravity, floating. How would it express its emotions through different directions, or would it at all? I think anyway, I went down the rabbit hole there with wondering like what the significance of all that was. And really briefly, another author that I found does this really well in thinking about up and down and all of this is Ursula Le Guin. So she has this wonderful story about ants called The Author of Acacia Seeds. And in one moment in the story, these scientists are trying to figure out, well, what does up with the queen mean in this one ant colony that they found all this kind of like evidence of a rebellion? And they realized, oh, we're interpreting this wrong. Up is really bad for ants. So up with the queen should actually be translated down with the queen, because there was evidence, again, of an ant rebellion here. So I thought this was really interesting to compare the subterranean space with the ocean as also a space of being below. Okay, so my next question was, is scuba diving itself a science fictional experience? Probably. I think there's a good case for this. Now, one really direct connection is that NASA uses underwater habitats to train its astronauts. So the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operation, or NEMO, right? It's a pretty good acronym. It uses the Aquarius Reef Base off the coast of Florida, which is the image in the bottom right here. And the astronauts will spend, days, if not weeks, in this habitat, and then perform missions outside, floating in the water, because floating is really similar to the experience of not having gravity when you're in outer space. And even the suits look similar. Like you can see on the left here, someone's descending in this really, really fancy suit. Now, the one difference between ocean environments and outer space that is very significant is water pressure. So in outer space, there's not like atmospheres of pressure pushing on you. So you can have like a really thin suit. It just has to be airtight. Whereas underwater, if you go too deep, you really need like to go thousands of feet under, or like hundreds or 1,000 feet underwater. You need something that's very tough and resistant to the pressure. So that's why when you see submersibles, they're always like a sphere, often a sphere shape, because it's very strong shape for resisting all that crushing pressure. Because every 33 feet is one atmosphere, and then so at 66 feet that would be I guess yeah, multiple atmospheres of pressure, like pushing down on you. And Jacques Cousteau also channeled some sort of science fictional, I guess you could say, descriptions when he talked about using the aqualung for the first time. And the first word he came up with for divers was menfish. So it's, it's kind of gendered, but he called the divers menfish. So it's almost this like post-human or mermaid-like creature, now that they have the freedom to dive without a cable, because the aqualung was the first scuba apparatus, which meant you didn't have to have a tether. You could just sort of swim off. And he had this really beautiful line in his book, The Silent World. So I'll just read this for you here. "From this day forward, we would swim across miles of country no man had known, free and level, with our flesh feeling what the fish scales know." And I thought this was so poetic for getting the reader to imagine sort of that becoming a fish means sort of feeling like a fish too, even at the level of your skin. And there's also times where he talks about just the sensory joy in putting in, like, sort of moving one's hands through water. So I think we see a little bit of science fiction here. We also see some in a personal hero of mine, Sylvia Earle's writings, like her book, Sea Change, A Message of the Oceans. Now, Sylvia Earle is an alumna of Duke University, and she actually spoke at my PhD graduation. I had no idea this was going to happen, but she did, and gave her just a really enchanting talk. I think that for charisma, she's on the same level as David Attenborough, is just this incredibly brilliant and good storyteller when it comes to narrating things. So I'll talk a little bit about her now. She has an organization called Mission Blue, which is based in San Francisco, and it's pretty active. She has it create things called Hope Spots, which are a global network of ocean conservation areas. And the idea is that if we can regenerate ocean life from these, they'll function as a kind of safety net for biodiversity in the ocean into the future. So yes, she has her own Lego figure. I've got this set downstairs, and she also is the subject of a book called Life in the Ocean, a really wonderful children's book, which details some of her own life story. And she grew up in Florida. She got her start studying seaweeds of all sea creatures. And so she's left behind a number of seaweed pressings that are at the Smithsonian Institution. But now she does most of her. She's actually amazingly energetic for her age, but she still does so much ocean advocacy. And in her younger years, though, she participated in a very amazing 2-week scientific research expedition called the Tektite Project. At the time, it was sort of covered in the media in these really essentialist ways, like aqua moms descend underwater, And anyway, it was an all-female team because at the time in the 70s, folks were worried about mixed gender crews. So it was all these women scientists who descended underwater and spent 2 weeks at the Aquarius reef base. And she writes about this story in her book, which I showed over here, Sea Change, A Message from the Oceans. And during this dive, she talks about the significance of the ocean as an environment of pressure. So I wanted to briefly just read 2 moments here. And the reason I think these are significant is because when you read someone's written account of what it's like to go diving, you get different sensory details than you would just of a photograph or with film. They don't always capture what's going on inside the body. And she had a pretty interesting description here. So during one moment when she was out with her friend collecting samples, some sand had clogged her regulator, and she found that she couldn't breathe she wasn't getting oxygen. So she describes the situation this way. So since they had been underwater breathing pressurized gas for a long time, she couldn't just ascend to the surface. So she says, sunlight and air were only 71 feet away overhead, but I was separated from them by a physiological barrier as effective as a brick wall. Racing for the surface for air with my tissues saturated with compressed gas would spell disaster, bubbles in my blood, pain, possible paralysis, and even death. Now, we know she lived to, survive to tell the tale, and she actually just ended up doing something called buddy breathing, which is sharing oxygen with your dive buddy. So they made it back to the habitat just fine. But I thought it was interesting as a way to describe the conditions of being water and what constitutes a barrier. And in this passage, she goes further and quotes another author, Robert Stenuit, who talks also about what it's like to adapt to living underwater and how pressure is such an important factor. So he says, living in the depths, I've become in certain ways a creature of those depths, adapted to their pressures. Now the human environment is temporarily intolerable to me. I need pressure. I must wait inside this life-saving prison of a decompression tank until I've been slowly weaned and made once more fit to live on Earth. So, this is pretty dramatic, but the sort of, I guess you could say, basic idea he's trying to convey is that when you're breathing underwater, you're accumulating all this pressurized gas in your blood. And when I was taking diving lessons, it was described to me sort of like this. You're a can of soda, and the longer you're underwater, the more you're getting carbonated. So if someone shakes you up and pops the top, that's all happening in your blood essentially, and you can get the bends. So you don't want to do that. You want to kind of pop the soda very, very slowly. This is an American metaphor. Cousteau called it champagne, and he used that to explain what was going on. So basically, you want to make sure the soda can that's you is very slowly depressurizing as you go back to the surface. And so this leads me to talk about some video games, okay, that also dramatize different ocean science fictions. We have Wii's Endless Ocean, we have the video game Subnautica, which is kind of a crafting game, and we have on the right a picture from Abzu. I'm not a gamer, my husband is, so I've only played the one on the right, and I have to say that Abzu is great. If you're not a gamer, this is a very accessible and fun game that doesn't have a lot of text, and it's really exploratory. So you get to kind of, I guess you could say, reveal the world as it's coming into being for you. However, in all of these games, one of the things that doesn't matter is pressure. In every case, the diver can go to whatever depth they want for however long they want, and they're not worried about the same things that Sylvia Earle is worried about, that Cousteau worried about, that any diver physically in the ocean has to worry about, which is, all right, how much air you got left, and how how long have you been underwater? Because if you've been underwater too long, you have to decompress, or like slowly, pop the top on the soda can to safely come back to the surface. And so I think this is one thing that often a lot of representations of the ocean don't address, is the question of pressure and how does the diver safely come back up. And I think that the games would probably be less fun to play if they if they had that constraint. But as a diver, I couldn't help but notice that factor. But Sylvia Earle also had another really wonderful thing to say at the towards the end of her book. And she talked about something called fathoming. So she looked up the origins of this word in Old English and discovered that fathoming originally meant the embracing arms. It was once defined by an act of parliament as the length of a man's arms around the object of his affections, and later became a nautical term for 6 feet. And so it used to be something like, oh, if you're fathoming, you're measuring how deep the water is. As a verb, fathom means to plumb the ocean depths, to probe their mystery. But I thought it was really amazing how she connected fathoming to sort of a hug, right? Like the embrace of arms as a way of measuring. So this, for me, makes a lot of difference, because when sometimes measuring is thought of as like very distant and objective, but when you use your own arms to measure something, that's implicating the observer, the person physically there. So I thought it was a really nice kind of way to think about, if you want to know something, if you want to fathom something, then you have to be there yourself. And Sylvia Earle has used this metaphor before too, but other ocean activists like Christine and Gerda have also said the following about the ocean: often referred to as the blue heart of the planet, the global ocean is vital for maintaining life as we know it on Earth. I prefer to call it the blue lungs of the planet, for ocean phytoplankton supply 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. So as an English professor, I thought this was a really lovely metaphor as well, like thinking about the ocean, not even as the heart of the planet, but a different organ, the lungs of the planet, the element that helps us all breathe happily. So I want to talk about now just sort of two last examples here of oceans in science fiction. And I began by describing different books, right? Different science fiction books that involve the ocean somehow. But I really think, and you can see me, I've been sort of building up to this, you can find science fictions all around you if you think about them as situations that offer a strange, new, speculative view or perspective on things. And this particular, I guess you could call it, maybe like a performance or stunt, was this is a photograph of something that the Maldives conducted in 2009, back when President Mohammed Nasheed was in office. And the Maldives is a very low-lying island chain in the Indian Ocean, and I think the highest elevation is maybe 7 feet in its capital. So the Maldives and many other Pacific islands and coastlines around the world are, of course, extremely concerned about sea level rise, which we know is connected to global warming and climate change, due to all our emissions. But sometimes when you're a small nation, it's hard to draw attention to the immediacy of feeling like we're going to be underwater soon. So one thing that the Maldives cabinet did was have an underwater cabinet meeting where everyone put on scuba gear, and right here it's showing they signed a commitment to become carbon neutral by a specific date. And so I saw this and I thought, wow, this looks like a science fiction in so many ways, because it's showing us this photograph of the event is showing us what the Maldives would look like if we don't do anything about climate change. So it's showing us a vision of the future, but it's doing this to try to prevent this from happening. So I thought it was a very kind of temporally complex, moment, but also just a really striking example of performing science fiction or performing something that looks like a science fiction, not just writing it in a book or depicting it in a movie. And then finally, I wanted to talk about why I've been interested in seaweeds, actually, which is sort of my new project here. This is a photograph I took also in one of the Channel Islands near where I live in Santa Barbara. And the big species we have here is giant kelp. It's sometimes called the redwood of the ocean or the sequoia of the sea. And it's this really just huge algae, or well, the official name is macroalgae or big algae. And it was around before plants, but it photosynthesizes. It grows towards the light. And I've been noticing a number of conversations in coastal California, but also places like Maine and Alaska that are wondering like, oh, can we mitigate climate change or do something better about it through seaweeds? Do they store carbon? Well, maybe the math is a little fuzzy on that. Do they, could they lead to better futures of food? Could they lead to a source of bioplastics? And I started noticing, oh, there's all these sort of hopeful speculations about what seaweeds could do in a way that to me makes them sound like they're caught in a science fiction story about the next big sort of technical change. So I've been really curious about where the stories that people are telling about seaweeds, and it's been sort of it's been interesting but difficult work to do because it doesn't take place in a book. It takes place in news articles. It takes place in sort of different events or events celebrating seaweed. We actually had a seaweed festival here in Santa Barbara just last October that was really interesting and fun because you always wonder like who's going to turn out to some an event like this in person. So everyone was kind of looking at each other going like, so are you a scientist, are you an artist? And there were a lot of artists at this too, so I decided I was like kind of, I guess, more towards the artist camp since I write about fiction. And so I just wanted to leave you with this sort of hopeful picture that we might not know what the next subjects of ocean science fiction are, but we can, I think, are invited to think with them, to imagine better futures with them. And the seaweeds are a really, I think, compelling subject for beginning to do that work. All right, well, thank you. I think we can move to Q&A now.
Thank you so much, Melody. That was a wonderful presentation. It has made me think of a lot of ocean elements in science fiction books that I've read, especially where they're converting algae to oxygen on, generation ships and that sort of
Yeah,
thing. So that was something that had
like
not
ocean
occurred to me.
farming, but in outer space.
Exactly, exactly. So we'll go ahead and open this up to questions. If anyone has a question, please type it in the chat, or we don't have a whole lot of us here, so you can go ahead and unmute and just ask if you have one.
Thank you.
Or if anyone has oh, there you go. Patrick asks, are all kelp algae?
Good question. Yes. So I had to learn a little bit about their taxonomy when I was first getting into this. So kelp is actually a Scottish word, and it now is used to describe mostly brown algae or brown macroalgae in the ocean. And there's two other types of seaweeds. So there's red seaweed and green seaweed, and then there's the brown seaweed. So those are kind of the three major branches, and the big umbrella is seaweed. All of them are seaweeds, but the brown seaweeds are also called kelp. And I could just maybe tell another story while we're waiting for a few more questions here. There's some interesting histories around what seaweed has been used for over the years. So seaweed, as we know it now, is in all kinds of products. It's in toothpaste, it's in ice cream, it's used in beauty products, it's used to stabilize beer foam. So, like when you see the really frothy ocean, and it has great foam, I think about like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And so these and so some of the extracts from seaweeds are used to do all kinds of things to make products smoother, or to help particles stay in suspension. And so we find them kind of almost invisibilized in all elements of products and food that we eat and we use, which is really different from places like let's see, like Ireland eats a lot of seaweed, northern France, Japan, East Asia. Um, there are many places around the world that I think make the seaweeds more visible in different kinds of cuisines. But there's also, I think, more dramatic histories about what seaweed was used for. So the giant kelp I just showed you, that was actually used as a source of an important gunpowder ingredient in World War One. So there was a whole harvesting operation in San Diego that was taking it, burning it, and then producing potash, which is a key ingredient in gunpowder. And I tried to do some field work in San Diego to check this out. There's a road that still bears the name Gunpowder Point. So I drove down there, but there was nothing to be photographed. It was like all converted to this kind of wetland, or restored wetlands area. So I didn't have anything to physically observe, unfortunately.
But
I wondered if kelp was related to kelpies, and I'm not sure. All I know is that they're both Scottish, and both relate to the ocean. So I think there's a strong chance, but I haven't done the full Oxford English Dictionary etymology dive into the two. Do I have a favorite sea-related fantasy or mythological creature? That's a great question. Okay. The fantastic is a little trickier, and I feel like I would love to read more sea fantasy, but I can't think of anything at the moment that's coming to mind, except that the one novel I mentioned, Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor, that definitely has elements of the folkloric or the mythic, not just the science fictional in it. And I think it's actually a really wonderful example of a genre bending book. It doesn't really say, sort of stick to even my definition of like just science fiction, because it's bringing in African folklore, and it's bringing in sort of elements of the fantastic at the same time. So like the aliens that arrive start to seem really close to this one indigenous mythic figure called Mami Wata, which were supposed to be benevolent figures that could bestow gifts, or correct ecological damage, or kind of be the vehicle of justice. So off the top of my head, I think maybe that's a good one for the fantastic. But I have a friend in San Diego who's writing a book about mermaids right now. I think she'd probably have even more references.
I have a question for our participants. I know that as I was listening to Professor Ju speak, I was thinking a lot about other books that were coming to mind that weren't necessarily science fiction, but still had some of those elements of discovery, of imagining a different world, or imagining what others might feel like, or something like that, that Jacques Cousteau talking about how we feel things as the fish feel. And I was wondering if our participants had any books that were popping up in your heads as that sort of thing. I was particularly thinking of Even just imagining the different worlds of getting well, Nnedi Okorafor, her book Binti, just going
Mm,
into, and that was one of her first that is African futurism, but it is about someone who is the first of her family, the first of her tribe to go to an off-world university and trying to fit into the cultures there, and picturing what that is like there. Of course, I am also a big science fiction fan, so that's where my brain went. But I'm curious if anyone else had any thoughts on that.
That's a great question. Oh, Heart of the Sea.
Okay.
Yep, Octavia Butler.
And we read Octavia Butler for a summer reading. Um, we did the Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents a few years ago as a summer reading project.
Oh,
So,
that's great. Also set in California, so the fire situation is
yeah,
a little bit. I mean, among other elements of those books, a little uncanny. Mhm.
that's wonderful. Anyone else? Or do you have any other questions for Professor Jew?
I was just gonna say sorry. Hi, this is
Hey,
Carrie. Um, I sort of missed it. We were having some barking, but I was also just thinking about like the way, like how I mean sort of related, unrelated, kind of the sea creatures are always sort of the mystery, the secret, the mysterious piece in like fantasy novels, and and in science fiction, and how I don't know, my brain, it's been a long day, that there's a little bit of a melting effect at this point.
no worries.
But but the yeah, I just you it's so interesting to me, and every time I read anything like any like fantasy or science fiction where there's like the sea or even just a sea creature, that there's always like some they're always made to be synonymous with mysteries or secrets or
Mhm.
things like that. It's more of a comment than a question, I guess. But
Yeah.
um I don't know why it's almost more mysterious than space. And you've sort of like spoken on that the whole time. So really, really excellent presentation. But
Oh,
it's
thank
making me think about like too many things to
you.
solidify it into like a coherent thought.
I think that's a thank you for your sharing your thoughts. I mean, it's I think a really on point observation. And speaking of secrets, like I recently watched the new Pixar film Luca, and the big secret there, of course, is that there's almost a kind of a homoerotic friendship between the main character and his bestie in there. And so like they're amphibious. They can be sea creatures underwater and then humans on land. And so the big secret is that they're actually sea creatures, and they're trying to suppress this the whole time. So that's actually maybe just one example that pops into my mind for the way that that particular animated film takes the characterization of like the sea with the secretive somehow, and does an interesting variation on it. And then I had another thought too when you mentioned that the sea creatures are often portrayed as other or secretive, and there's sometimes another reversal of that. So still, when you try to think from their perspective, so Sylvia Earle, who's just, again, such a wonderful storyteller, had a really interesting way of putting this. So she said she imagined herself when she's going to a coral reef, that's the city and she's the alien coming in to visit, because she doesn't belong there, and she's descending from, some ship, right? Like she's descending from a ship going down to the city that is the coral. And there's so many cool things we know about coral now, like fish actually sing, like fish make sounds. And so if you stick a microphone down there, you can listen to this bird-like chorus of fish making like kind of glug glug or like chirping almost noises. And then other creatures like shrimp contribute to that too. And so on both the kind of density level and also the sound level, coral reefs are very, very, I think, city-like in their in their forms. And the same thing happened to me, I think, when I first took my initial dive underwater. Like, oh, I'm in a nature documentary. Like, I'm dropping in. Like, I'm not supposed to be here, but the fish are like, oh, hey, just kind of going about their business. So yeah, sometimes the reverse is fun too, when you think of yourself as the alien coming in to visit the city of sea creatures. Oh, someone's doing an underwater D&D campaign. That's great. I totally support that.
So, talking about being the alien coming into visiting things, I think that's a really interesting idea and a really cool way to approach, um, to make it very broad, reading fiction in general, because I mean, a lot of times these are these worlds that we're not used to, that we're not, um, I've been reading Ship of Fools, which is our classics book for this month, and it takes place in 1931 on a ship going from Mexico um, to Germany. And I have nothing in common with most of these people on this ship, but it just you come in and you see, all right, well, let's look at
Mm,
what's going on here and try and figure it all out. And oftentimes in those oh yeah, so someone's mentioning Becky Chambers here, yes. Um, about coming in, and we always have, a lot of times in fiction there is, or in movies, there's a character that is the stand-in for the reader who has to get all of the exposition
that's
explained to
totally
them and
Octavia
everything.
Butler.
Yeah, I mean, and like it shows up in so many different books. You have well, I'm going to explain the detective in the mystery novel is, going and explaining things to the new person who's coming in or whatever. Um, and that's the analog for us,
Mhm.
as the reader, but thinking of us as the alien coming in, I think that's a really cool twist on it too. Um, so thank you for bringing
I
that
really
up.
like
That's
that
really
reading.
cool.
Yeah, yeah. And you have to be careful, don't step on or damage anything. It's kind of a like an ethical position to be the alien coming in. Mhm. Also like the Becky Chambers connection too, with yeah, being the outsider. And I think that, one other thing I tried to say in my book about diving is that it's not like being an all-powerful amphibian where you're like, I can go to I can go to the ocean and I can go to the land. What I tried to talk about with especially the pressure conversation is that, nah, you're actually, it's a very temporary thing. And even to get back to land, you have to decompress and get back to being sort of adjusted to the terrestrial pressure level so that it can be safe for you again. So I really saw diving, not so much about like acquiring a new superpower as much about kind of shift, like changing your identity for just a temporary period of time so that you can see and observe and experience and then come back to tell people what you saw. And Becky Chambers was great, by the way. Kara and I were talking about all her amazing fiction, I think, in sort of before the live stream opened. Oh, okay. The new Andy Weir book. I haven't read this one yet, but that sounds really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, you sort of make me regret my life choices that led to me never going diving. It sounds like it just, it must be.
My only recommendation is go somewhere warm. It's a little bit easier for a new person. less gear to put on. There's also really interesting freshwater diving too, actually. So sometimes there's dive societies around like lakes. And one of the most interesting places I've ever dove was, well, this one's also kind of a trek, but it's the cenotes that are in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And they're these incredible freshwater caverns. And cavern is safer than cave because cavern means there's like pockets open to the surface in different places. And they're like optically just incredible. So you start in these different, let's see, they're almost like, windows in the ground to get to the caverns. And when you go through a narrow passage, all of your bubbles float up and then they pool on the ceiling, like if you let balloons go, they go up, right? So there's all your bubbles on the ceiling. And if you glance up, it looks like liquid mercury that's just kind of gathering there. And then there are other cool kind of, again, visual effects as you sort of move through other parts of the cavern. And I actually get really motion sick. So for me to get to try to go somewhere where it's on land, I realized I don't have to take Dramamine. So it was incredible. I was like, I feel great. And even though it's, dark and a little scary, it's like, I don't have to go on a boat this time. So it was really pretty special. So there are all kinds of freshwater environments around the world that also have interesting things and environments to see too. Who did the map of the oceans? I'll type it in the chat. So I think this one, this was posted with, I believe, a Creative Commons license, or where would it have been? I think I saw it on Flickr. And so I got the permissions for my book, but she had posted it pretty openly anyway.
One of the other things you mentioned was our thoughts about gravity and the ups and everything like that. And as you were saying that, I had the the classic Orson Scott Card Ender's Game stuck in my head, where as they're going through the battle room, it's the enemy gate is down, so they're changing their perspective within the space there. But and that's something that I've always thought about, that element of like, oh, okay, well, trying to think about the perspective, changing perspective of anything, but thinking about it in the sense of, a completely round creature or something that's in the ocean deep, what is up?
That actually should have been a reference. Yeah, that should have been a reference for me because
Okay.
absolutely, I think that there's similar work with perspective shifting going on. But the person I did end up citing is this anthropologist David Valentine, who's thinking about outer space. And like, I can't recall it exactly, but he kind of wondered, like, what would your reflexes be like in outer space if you were on like one of those rotating cylinder colonies, hypothetically, or like an asteroid or some other place with different conditions of gravity, even if it was just like you, kind of floating a little bit more as you jumped or something. So I thought that was also pretty compelling as a way to shake up what we're habituated to. So yeah, I ended up thinking a lot about habits and how all the changes I was talking about with oceans, those questions could be asked in other environments too. So outer space or like a high altitude environment, for the pressure question. and things like that. Let's see. Always think of how astronauts train in water for space. Yeah, yeah, the Nemo astronauts.
I started to type it, but it's taking forever. But yeah, talking about the cylindrical spaceships, I recently read a generation ship book, Breaking Day. I know Patrick credit too, because he's the one who recommended it to me.
Oh,
Um, but talking about going on these cylinders, and it's as they're getting close to the planet where they're going to land, some of the people who have been born and lived on this ship their entire life are talking about how strange it will be to be somewhere and see the horizon as something that goes down instead of up, um,
oh,
which
yeah.
was a really interesting perspective shift as well. Um,
Hmm.
so
That's really fascinating. Yeah, yeah, and reacclimating to a planet. Hmm. What was the name of that book again?
it was braking day, but it's braking as in like I'm putting the brakes on, Braking.
Okay.
And I
This is great
can't.
for me too. I'm getting all kinds of recommendations.
Oh yeah, I have. I was also thinking about. You would probably appreciate "The Past Is Red" by Catherine Valenti.
Hmm.
It takes place on the Great Garbage Patch. Um,
Oh, that's totally on my list. I remember seeing this
it's
cover.
it's
Yep. Hmm.
very snarky and good. But
Sounds excellent.
um, well, as we've now devolved into me offering book recommendations, I want to see if anybody else has any other questions. Um, and uh, for Melody Jew here. And if not, we will go ahead and